Oh, it's a really good question. I guess I would say that I was originally inspired to write this book because of the death of a friend of mine from our little high school in Allentown, Pennsylvania. His name was Dana. He was a couple years younger than me, but we did the school plays every year, and he was just kinetic, this totally vibrant, amazing force. Very small, like less than 5 feet tall, under 100 pounds, um, but just an absolutely brilliant, funny guy. And when I found out that after about 15 years of escalating opioid use, he had hanged himself in the woods behind our old middle school, I was really just sort of broken up inside because Dana was such a lively presence to me. And I couldn't believe that we had lost him before he was even into his adulthood. He was 30 years old. Um, but my high school had lost a lot of people like that. We had lost a lot of people to overdoses, to drug use, and to suicides. And I don't think that we are unusual in that sense. I don't think that Allentown, Pennsylvania is actually that different from most of the places across the country dealing with massive levels of opioid use, drug use, suicides, and overdoses throughout the late 2010s and into the early 2020s. But I really wanted to know how we had failed Dana, why our treatment systems were so insufficient, and what had allowed him to fall through the cracks. And I don't think I'm alone in that question.
That's Emily Dufton, a historian who's written a new book on the links between the opioid epidemic and the war on drugs. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Emily Dufton is a historian, podcast host, and author whose new book, Addiction Inc., explores how the much-forgotten war on drugs may have led to a causal effect on the American opioid epidemic that followed. Early in my journalism career and my work as a mental health coach, I sat at the center of these two moments, not even realizing what was happening. In her first book, Emily explains how the promising new treatments that emerged as a radical public health experiment during President Richard Nixon's war on drugs in the 1970s blossomed into a network of federally funded treatment clinics operating nationwide. Emily explores how these clinics and the networks that grew around them turned into an immensely profitable private sector industry that, because of the government's role in funding it, was able to offer poor care at high costs to many people. It's probably indisputable that what emerged from the war on drugs has made recovery harder, not easier. The first major federal criminalization of drugs came with the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which effectively criminalized cannabis through taxation and other enforcement mechanisms. That era set the foundation for federal drug control and viewing substance abuse as illegal and not a medical problem. In the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, Congress consolidated dozens of drug laws into a single framework and created the modern drug scheduling system that became the backbone of all subsequent enforcement and sentencing policies. In 1971, the moment when Emily focuses on, the beginning of her story, President Nixon formally announced a national war on drugs, framing drug use as a major domestic threat. In addition to creating the first centralized national drug policy apparatus, he also began medically assisted treatment. These efforts were meant to be a counterbalance. In essence, the federal government would fund clinics to treat addiction to work on the demand side of the problem. The Reagan era saw a massive escalation in the punitive measures, but treatment facilities like methadone clinics continued to grow. And it turned into quite a profitable, even if ineffective, option. When most people of a certain age think of the war on drugs, they think of First Lady Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. But the moves by Nixon are far more consequential to our present. Through the cartel wars in the 1980s and the tough on crime era of the 1990s, the private treatment business continued to flourish. I can remember standing on West 43rd Street in the heart of Times Square in 2002. It was just after Rudy Giuliani had left his role as America's mayor. I was reading about how his new consulting firm, Giuliani Partners, was hired by Purdue Pharma. It caught my attention because I knew that Purdue was hiring Rudy and the crew that left with him in City Hall. And that was a sign that something was really wrong at the company. Just 4 years later, Giuliani was negotiating with the Department of Justice, where he successfully convinced his former colleagues to reject the recommendations of career prosecutors and accept misdemeanor charges against the company for misbranding OxyContin. That time period was an industry driven with pharmaceutical companies trying to make even more money out of addiction. At one point, Purdue, the makers of the most addictive opioid that was ravaging the country, considered entering the anti-addiction market, both making the drug fueling addiction and another to treat it. Where Purdue did not go in, other pharmaceutical companies filled the breach. Based on her original research, Emily explores missed opportunities with medically assisted treatment, known as MAT. It transformed Nixon's war into a commercial success that turned into a public health disaster. Emily offers her own prescription for what it will take to find a better way. Today, we're going to talk about all of that. So, Emily, I just wanted to thank you for joining me for this conversation. We met through, my former guest, and now I am proud to say friend, Brian Santana. And, Brian has said a couple times to me that I would love someone. And he said that about you, and he was spot on. So, in terms of like making friends, maybe I don't know whether he should create an app or that should be a side job, but he has this knack for figuring out what kind of people would find other people interesting. And, when I found out about your work with your upcoming book, Addiction Inc., and some of your research that you had done before that as a historian, I was just so fascinated. One, because I think some of these issues around substance abuse and mental health, and also public policy and how we respond to it, are so interesting. But I think both in my career as a journalist and working in mental health, got a glimpse on this journey we've been on. And it's been really interesting to watch. And I'm really looking forward to talking to somebody who's spent time putting a really powerful lens on this story.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, for having me. This is a real honor. And shout out to Brian Santana for bringing us together. I totally agree. When Brian says I should talk to someone, I always take his advice because he's always right. And you're entirely right that it has been a journey. America's history with opioid addiction treatment, its policy, its disbursement, the way it's used, the way people access it, has been nothing short of a rather Odyssean journey, starting from a really surprising place. So we were talking before about the background for this book. And as I told you, I spent 8 years researching this history, trying to understand how this one particular subset of addiction treatment came to be the way it was. I was really fascinated by the history of medication-assisted treatment in the United States, which is a unique form of addiction treatment that uses medications, which is a really important distinction when over 90% of America's treatment programs do not. So again, thanks to Brian for bringing us together. I can't wait to talk about the history of MAT with you.
Yeah, it is really, really fascinating. And it's very interesting, sort of like if I take the span of my career there's always been some element of this around. When I was a young journalist, it was the methadone clinics that existed and the other treatment. And then as we've traveled on and seen the other versions of it, it's been really fascinating because, and I think this really resonated with me about some of your work, it feels like such a smart idea and such a missed opportunity with the way that we implemented it. And, I wanted to sort of like take you back to sort of, I think the first period of time where I started thinking about it was back in sort of the early days for me of working in mental health. And I started in about 2007. So about a year into that, I remember I was working as a mental health coach and I was working at this psychological and psychiatric practice in Virginia. And I remember going out to this dinner in Leesburg at this really nice restaurant called Tuscarora Mill. And it was a bunch of the psychiatrists in our office, psychologists in our office, me, and a doctor who had come to pitch the drug Suboxone. And the way that it was presented to us, it was, an opportunity for some medical education, but it was nothing short of a true pitch for the power of it. And I remember when I was sitting there at that dinner, it was really the first time I think I had thought about a drug like Suboxone, which is, used in opioid addiction treatment to help wean people off of opiates. And I was hearing about this drug that used the same properties, right? It attached to those opioid receptors, but it did it in a way that would allow people to exit their addiction. And I just thought to myself, wow, if this is right, this is a powerful game changer compared to some of the other drugs that we've seen. And it had this opportunity to be so life-saving. But what I think I realized over time, which I should have caught on to as that doctor was pitching us, is that the industry's incentives are very, very different than what I would say the incentives of those who are focused on quality care and getting people sort of the best practice for getting people over and off this. And I'm just curious about that time period and that window and what your thoughts on it are.
Sure. I think the fact that you were working at a clinic in 2007, 2008, and witnessing firsthand the pitches from Suboxone salespeople is incredible. That you have this front row witnessing into what is actually a totally transformational period in the history of opioid addiction treatment in the United States. So you're catching on to Suboxone at a moment when American drug policy has really radically shifted in recent years. In the year 2000, the company that produced Suboxone, it was called Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals. It was an extremely small company. It only had about 4 employees, and it was mostly focused on transforming federal drug policy because prior to the year 2000, it was illegal for any doctor or medical provider to prescribe an opioid drug on the basis of simply, quote unquote, maintaining someone's physical dependence on opioids. So if you had an opioid addiction in the 90s, which a growing number of people were developing problems with because of the mass marketing of OxyContin by Purdue, you couldn't go to your doctor and be like, I'm having a real problem here. Do you have anything that you can help me get me off of OxyContin or street heroin or anything like that? The doctor could actually face legal sanctions for prescribing any medication for this. And very few medications even existed. Your option for any kind of medication-assisted treatment was, as you said, to go to a methadone clinic. And those have been around since the 1970s. So by that point, 20, 30 years. But in 2000, Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals scored this huge win when it successfully lobbied Congress to pass and President Clinton to sign the Drug Abuse Treatment Act of 2000, which said that Schedule III narcotics could be prescribed from a private physician's office and dispensed from a private pharmacy for the treatment of opioid addiction, for the maintenance of the physical dependence of opioids. But it was only Schedule III drugs, and it was only through pharmacists and medical providers who had registered with the DEA, completed 8 hours of training, and completed an X waiver available again through the DEA. Now, this was a resounding win for the transformation of American drug policy. Never before had maintenance been allowed to be conducted from the privacy of a doctor's office since America's morphine clinics in the 1920s closed. So that's, a good 80 years. But it was done in a really crafty way, in that Data 2000 only legalized access to Schedule III drugs, which was only buprenorphine. And the only producer of buprenorphine for maintenance was Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals. So they crafted themselves a monopoly on the burgeoning buprenorphine industry. And it was only Suboxone that was allowed to be dispensed by these registered physicians.
Because a lot of the opioids that existed that you might think about like researching, like hydrocodone or something else like that, are all Schedule II. Is that right?
Schedule 1 or Schedule 2.
Schedule 1 or
exactly.
Schedule 2. And so just so I have this right, so at that time, before that law was prescribed, let's say I went into my doctor and I said, or I did have back pain. Let's say I was in a car accident, very common thing that people can relate to. They may put you on opioids. And one of the things that I know often happens, I've seen this to so many people who are not, clients, they're my friends. And they don't know that they're building a heavy dependency over the time that they need the initial treatment. So before that time, if I had been on, let's say, Vicodin and, my prescription ran out and I wasn't supposed to get any more, I couldn't go back to my doctor and say, hey, man, I am having these wild withdrawal effects. Could you titrate me down or something like that? I couldn't even do that. Right?
No, and for the most part, the doctor wouldn't really know how to do that either. Addiction medicine has only been taught as late as 2018 in, I think, 15 of the country's 180 medical schools. There's not a lot of understanding of how to treat opioid addiction. In the 1990s, there certainly wasn't a real understanding of how addictions were developed, and doctors played an extraordinarily important role in increasing Americans' access to opioids. But they didn't know too much better because, again, remember, Purdue is selling these drugs as essentially problem-free and addiction-free and not causing any of the problems with opioids that Americans had experienced over the previous 100 plus years since they were readily available. So, yeah, exactly. If you're you have back pain or something, it's the late 90s, early 2000s, your doctor prescribes you OxyContin and continues to prescribe you OxyContin because the pain isn't getting better. All of a sudden, you've developed a real problem with it. You're physically dependent on these drugs. You go to your doctor, you say, I'm having an issue, and the doctor really has nothing to offer you. You can go to a methadone clinic, but there's very few of them. They're usually in very seedy areas of cities or in very distant areas if you're rural. You have to show up every day according to very strict regulations to dose. So you have to be there before dawn in the morning every day, Christmas, New Year's, it doesn't matter. Or you can go through withdrawal. You can go to a 12-step program. You can go to counseling. You can go to inpatient or outpatient treatment. But there was nothing as far as medications were concerned, essentially, that was available to you beyond methadone and naltrexone, which is an opioid antagonist, which we can table and talk about later. But nothing like Suboxone, nothing like buprenorphine was available until, and legally, it was finally available in 2000. But then, of course, Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals, small company, has to then get through the FDA approval. And that, of course, takes a few more years as well. But this transformational treatment technique, which was really birthed because of the escalating rates of both heroin use in the 1990s and prescription opioid use in the 90s and early 2000s, Suboxone finally comes on the market in 2003, and it's being promoted as a new and easier avenue for medication-assisted treatment for the growing number of Americans who are developing real and substantial problems with opioids by 2005, 2006.
It's so striking to me when you describe that and you describe the way that the pharmaceutical company was approaching it, right? It was a very strategic approach. We're going to lobby, we're going to get the law changed. Not only are we going to get the law changed, we're going to get it changed in a way where we're the only company that can really benefit from it. It's some slick, strategic, um, strategic business work. And then I contrast that with my experience in the medical community. And I mean, I feel like we were all naive waves. We're sitting there just thinking, wow, this is going to help. Like, we probably in the moment could not fathom the slick business moves that were happening in the background. And even if we could well, maybe if we could fathom them, we could see it. But it still would have been hard to see what impact those business decisions, and I think this is some of what you were getting at, would actually have on our clients, our patients, on treatment in general.
Absolutely. And what is interesting, though, is that in the very beginning, right, from 2003 to about 2005, 2006, Suboxone was not like a slick commercial industry. Like these four guys really had no idea what they were doing. They were policy guys. They were good at changing laws. They were good at generating political support. They were good at getting through regulations, like getting FDA approval and things like that. But they were not salespeople. So Suboxone actually had pitiful sales between 2003 when it first arrived on the market and about 2005, 2006. What transformed and what really informed that moment when you saw that pitch in 2007, 2008 was the year 2005 when the original president of Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals, his name was Charles O'Keefe, he retires. He's getting older. His wife has cancer. He's gotten Suboxone across the finish line. He got Data 2000 passed. He got it FDA approved. He's frustrated by the lack of sales because he really did intend it to be a helpful agent to bring more people into treatment because methadone clinics were so insufficient and oftentimes stigmatizing. And because, opioid use was escalating at this moment, there was no denying it. But he wasn't a salesperson. He was really bad at marketing. The federal government was doing nothing to help promote it from a public health standpoint. So he retires. Charles O'Keefe retires. And Reckitt Benckiser, which is based in England, brings over a young man named Sean Thaxter, who very much is a salesperson. And what Sean Thaxter quickly realizes is that Suboxone can literally follow in the wake of OxyContin and can be sold as the treatment for rising rates of prescription opioid addiction that's spreading up the Appalachian Trail and nationwide. And he's helped in this process by hiring hundreds of laid off Purdue pharmaceutical salespeople because Purdue at
You
that
mean,
point is coming under intense legal scrutiny for addicting millions of Americans to its drugs. So as they're purging workers, they're purging salespeople, Sean Thaxter at Reckitt Benckiser starts to hire them.
he's like,
And
I'm going to hire the guys who created this drug problem to help me solve it.
start the fire, sell the hose. Here it is.
Yeah,
So
it reminds me of like arms dealers, right? Like, I'm going to sell weapons to this country so they can invade that country. Then I'm going to sell weapons to that country to defend themselves against the country that's attacking them. Where,
exactly.
yeah, you're actually not, there's no sort of benefit really happening. All you're doing, harm is being created or manufactured and people are making money off of it. And then the other end, you know, people are making money off of that. I remember the stories about Purdue and internally at Purdue, they were really concerned from a marketing perspective about the increasing rate of opioid addiction. And it depends on who tells the story because there's a version of the story where there were some people who were like, why are we not making money off of both sides of this? And there's another version of the story where people say, for marketing, for PR reasons, for altruistic reasons, you pick, they wanted to get in the business of opioid treatment. And it's just mind boggling to me that the people who know they're creating the problem, the people who have the data that could tip everyone off early that this problem exists, don't do that. And also, consider profiting off of the treatment side of it.
Right, right. And I think the only reason Purdue is kind of held back, well, I think one of the many reasons Purdue was held back from actively pursuing addiction treatment medications, although I think they're kind of getting into it a bit now, was because they were coming under such immense legal fire in the mid 2000s, right? This is when thousands of lawsuits poured in from like Staten Island alone, so numerous state attorneys general were really starting to light the fire. And it was 2007 that the federal government finally got involved, and the Department of Justice sought to really punish Purdue Pharmaceuticals for its criminal misbranding, for its mismanagement of its drug, for putting out false information. And of course, they do not get punished because America's Mayor Rudy Giuliani sweeps in and negotiates with the DOJ and gets three of Purdue's main executives to plead guilty to misdemeanors, right? Not felonies, but misdemeanors, and to kind of get slaps on the wrist, right? Purdue continued to market and sell OxyContin after 2007. The DOJ settlement, which the judge was unhappy with, everyone at DOJ was unhappy with, but Purdue was very happy with, did very little to actually stem the rising tide of prescription opioid use and the problems that it launched. And it created a wonderful opportunity for a little company called Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals, because again, as Data 2000 suggested, this is a company that had complete and total control over the buprenorphine market. And there was really this was not like, by that point, it's not a public health imperative, right? It's really being launched almost solely as a business. I would say in the beginning, when some people that I talked to, right, I talked to one whistleblower in particular. Her name is Gail Groves Scott, and she was hired by Purdue very early, or excuse me, she was hired by Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals very early in Suboxone's existence, shortly after she got fired from Purdue. And she had been selling OxyContin throughout Virginia and Pennsylvania. And she was very familiar with the drug, and she was happy with it. She believed it when Purdue said, "Oh, we've remade the drug. It's less abusable now. Everything is fine." But then she started seeing the problems firsthand, and she did have issues with OxyContin and what Purdue was doing. So when she got hired by Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals afterwards, she really did feel like she was doing something good. Right? She wanted to be part of the solution. She saw the problems that OxyContin was causing firsthand. And she says, well, now I can be part of the solution to the problem. Suboxone is going to help get people off of OxyContin and street drugs and heroin, and it's going to allow them to achieve recovery. And this is great. And so in the beginning, Reckitt Benckiser's, they're called clinical liaisons, or CLs. That was their name for salespeople. The CLs like Gail Groves Scott really did feel like they were doing something when no one else was, right? Opioid addiction is a rising problem, and here they feel like they're really starting to make a positive change. But things start to transform for both the CLs and the leaders at Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals by the early 2010s, when Reckitt Benckiser's 7-year monopoly on the drug, which is what was allotted to it because of the Orphan Drug Act, which was passed in 1983, and that's how Suboxone kind of slipped into legality. There's a whole story about that, but maybe we don't have to go into like the weeds of federal regulation right now, unless that's what your listeners want. And in that case, that's great. But basically, oh no, I forget where I was going with this.
Well, I wanted to ask you something, because you mentioned that period, 2000 to 2005. Right around that time, and by the way, so when I worked at the New York Times, I covered the Giuliani administration and I covered City Hall, so I had a good idea of the players, good idea of their character, good idea of a lot of things related to them, and to a varying degree, some really smart, interesting people. Also, as history is sort of borne out, maybe some people whose motives are not always lovely. But as soon as I heard opioids and the idea of an opioid crisis was not on my radar, but as soon as I saw that Giuliani's consulting firm, Giuliani Partners, was hired by Purdue I remember saying to one of my colleagues, I don't know what's going on here, but they have some kind of killer secret that they're
Mhm,
hiding. And the way that it was initially publicized was as lobbying. And I looked at the team that was going to be working with them and I was like, they've got a problem. There is
mm,
some problem. And so looking back at that moment, one, I say to myself, you're a terrible reporter because you should have taken that clue you had and run it down. But the second piece of it for me is it's a reminder to me that long before the medical community, long before regulators even have a clear picture of serious problems, the pharmaceutical companies have so much data on what's happening with their medications that they know. And that's also the time period. I don't know if you spend any time looking into people like Dr. Paul Volkman. He is a doctor who ran a pill mill, and it was mainly he was a doctor in Chicago, just a very esteemed doctor, but it was a pill mill in Southern Ohio. It impacted West Virginia, it impacted Kentucky, and he was the largest physician dispenser of OxyContin in the United States between, I think, 2003 and 2005. Ultimately, one of the few people who was like convicted in a virtual life sentence ultimately for his work. But he was but one of so many people who doctors who did not have training in pain or addiction medicine or any related discipline. Often, doctors who had sort of been either cast out of something or were looking for a profit, who were doing this all over the country. And now, in retrospect, we know pharmaceutical companies like Purdue had that information. So, when I think of the future that we see with Suboxone, I think I walked into looking at Suboxone in the later years of watching it with a lot more skepticism.
mm.
And I think I'm curious if you think if, I think we frame these things as the general public or as treatment providers through a public health lens, that we have to recognize that while the public health lens may come first for us, it doesn't necessarily come first for everyone else.
Mhm, mhm. I think that's entirely correct, and I think you really saw that come to a head in about 2013. So this is the moment where Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals is about to lose its lockhold on the monopoly that they have had over buprenorphine. Either Suboxone, which is, I guess we should distinguish, right? Suboxone is the one that most people, like most patients, get from their provider, from their local pharmacy. And that's actually buprenorphine, which is a partial opioid agonist, mixed 4 parts to 1 with 1 part with naloxone, which is an opioid antagonist. And this is supposed to be an abuse deterrent. That way, if you like crush down Suboxone pills that used to come originally in tablets, or if you melt down the sublingual strips that it now comes in, they're like Listerine strips you put under your tongue. The naloxone would counteract the buprenorphine if you were to inject it, and ultimately put the person directly into withdrawal. So it was an abuse deterrent. Subutex is a pure buprenorphine form without the naloxone, but that is restricted to places like hospitals and emergency rooms, and for certain patients like pregnant women who are not recommended to take Suboxone. But Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals was the only company making these 2 versions of buprenorphine, and they had a total lock on the market. And they enjoyed that lock for almost a decade. And so at the time, yeah, they're doing a little bit of public health education because otherwise it doesn't really exist. They have CLs who are out there, like Gail Groves Scott, doing what she calls hand holding with her physicians, teaching them about addiction medicine, teaching them about how to use these medications, because most doctors are like the doctor you talked about in Chicago. They're just selling opioids for the profit motive, and there's not there's very little as far as a safety net is concerned to help the people who develop problems with these drugs. So that's what CL's and Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals is kind of trying to start to do in the beginning.
Well, and it also had another brilliant thing to it, because you got to be crafty to beat an addict. And one of the brilliant things I felt about Suboxone, just like you were saying, it had the buprenorphine and it also had the naloxone in it. And the naloxone really served as, I guess the best way to put it, you had the strips and you're supposed to take it under your tongue or your cheek. It stayed inactive that way. But if you decided to take out your spoon and turn it into liquid and inject it, it would become active and trigger withdrawal. And I'm like, you guys are almost as brilliant as addicts, because addicts are brilliant. I mean, it's hard to stay ahead of them.
It's hard to see. Well, so this was their clever way to get it out of, because most other treatment medications were stuck within the quarantine methadone clinics, which are some of the most heavily regulated medical industries in the United States. But whereas it started off with like maybe some public health dreams, it quickly becomes that exact same commercial enterprise, just like Purdue Pharmaceuticals' nonstop sales of OxyContin, because by 2013, Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals is about to lose its monopoly. It's really worried about this because Suboxone and Subutex are the company's only products. And so they start engaging in the exact same behavior as Purdue Pharmaceuticals did with OxyContin. It starts criminal misbranding. It starts telling lies about its products. It starts actively working to keep generic competition off of the market. Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals starts to do the exact same things, playing from the exact same sort of pharma company playbook that Purdue is using.
What were those things?
So that is what Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals specifically did, in the same way that OxyContin was Purdue was promoting OxyContin as less abusable and less prone to addiction in its marketing materials. Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals was doing the exact same thing with its marketing materials by arguing that its new product, which was the strip, was safer than the tablets. So in 2013, it debuts a new product. Suboxone used to be these tablets. You have to put them under your tongue because if you swallow a buprenorphine, it gets neutralized by the liver. You can't swallow it directly. You have to have it dissolve in your mouth. And so for about 10 years, the buprenorphine that was available as Suboxone was these little tablets. But as Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals is starting to lose its monopoly over those tablets and generic tablets are going to come on the market, it's called product hopping, where it basically took Suboxone, it's the exact same drug, but it changed the way it was manufactured. Delivered, right?
It's then extend your patent on that part. Right.
And the generic version of the tablet isn't coming out, or the generic version of the strip isn't coming out for a while. So what Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals proceeds to do is then promote its brand new patent-protected under-tongue strip as the safest form of buprenorphine available by marketing the idea, this is not a correct idea, but the idea the tablets were more dangerous for kids. Because they came in a big bottle, looked like candy, kids could eat a bunch of doses at once, and that amount of buprenorphine into their blood system would result in an overdose, a potentially lethal overdose.
If they're successful in selling that story to the public and the medical community, that discourages generic providers from coming on the market with pills. And even if the generic providers do come on the market with the pill, you still have a story to sell about why you should buy my strips.
Right. These individually foil wrapped strips are safer for, parents who have small children at home. They're better for everyone. They put on like a 10-digit number code on every foil wrapper. And they said that would be easier to track them in case there was diversion. Although they never set up a tracking system to track the numbers, so the numbers were actually all meaningless. But Reckitt Benckiser starts lying about the new and improved safety of its patent-protected strips the moment tablets start to come on the market. And they do so not only to individual patients, individual customers, but also to entire state Medicaid agencies. And they really start to push this really, really hard, especially in places like Massachusetts, which had one of the largest Medicaid systems for addiction treatment in the United States. So RBP leaders and executives are pushing really hard for Massachusetts state Medicaid company to drop tablets entirely, arguing that they are way too dangerous for kids and exclusively reimburse from the state Medicaid system Regabenki's pharmaceuticals, Suboxone strips. And they get it. They actually convince Massachusetts to do this. And that is one of the moments where, because of their blatantly illegal and criminal mismarketing of this substance, this is what actually ends up driving the 2020 Department of Justice settlement against them, or the legal case that ultimately brings down RBP for its criminal work.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense. Yeah, I wanted to step back for a second because one of the interesting things about your cover, which I love, is that it's got Richard Nixon on top of a needle. I think it's brilliant, by the way.
Thank
so,
you.
so Nixon on top of a needle. And I wanted to ask you just a little bit about the history, of what was going on in the 1970s when Nixon began the war on drugs and how medically assisted treatment really emerged as a byproduct of that and what kind of impact it had during that period.
Sure. So I think when we think of Richard Nixon and we think of the war on drugs, I feel like we all have a really strong image in our head, right? Of Nixon, the proud supporter of law and order who, believes that police and laws and prosecutions, that's the way to uphold our values, that's the way to bring peace into the streets. And when he does come to the presidency, kind of squeaks into the presidency in 1968, he is looking at a landscape, a national landscape that is full of frightening levels of crime, rising rates of drug use, specifically in urban cities, and the mounting problems that are associated with these two things, right? We're coming off of the long, hot summer of 1967, when over 1,000 racial uprisings had really demolished a lot of major sections of American cities. In 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated in April. Numerous cities, including Washington, D.C., erupt into riots again. When Nixon comes on, he's offering this idea of law and order as a response to what he sees as the escalating chaos in America's cities, driven primarily by crime and reports of rising drug use, especially heroin use. But when I started researching this book a little bit more, I realized that this one key moment in the Nixon administration, which is June 17th, 1971, when he famously says that he is going to declare a new all-out offensive against heroin, which he describes as public enemy number one. What he actually launches on that June day in 1971 is the total opposite of what he had been advocating earlier. This was not the promotion of law and order. This was not the promotion of more arrests. This was not the promotion of a continued reliance on criminal justice and supply reduction. What he actually offered in June 1971 was something totally new, which was an executive level office with its director reporting directly to Nixon himself, called the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, or SAODAP, which was going to fund hundreds of nationalized, federally funded addiction treatment clinics nationwide. It was a total 180 from what he was offering before, and it was caused by essentially three things. One was rising rates of crime, one was rising rates of heroin use, and one was the threat of tens of thousands of heroin-addicted soldiers coming home from the disastrous war in Vietnam, where not only had they partaken in brutal things like the My Lai massacre and various other forms of harm against Vietnamese civilians, but also now they were addicted to the cheap and plentiful and extremely pure heroin that was widely available in the Golden Triangle of production there.
That is fascinating. I had assumed, and it sounds like my assumption is wrong, that the reason why the Nixon administration pushed for medically assisted treatment was sort of like a compromise position because they were going to be tough on drugs. But I had not thought of those factors, particularly the war itself.
The
It,
war is the thing that pushes it the most. Like, that is the real deciding factor, because it was earlier that spring in 71 where two congressmen were sent to kind of study the global heroin problem and report on rates of trafficking and things like that. And they went to places like Turkey, they went to Switzerland, they went to France. And they're like, wow, yeah, there really is a global heroin production system very much in place. It was the French Connection was probably the most powerful and prominent one at the time. And they said, yeah, this is really an issue because there's a lot of heroin being produced. It is being sent almost exclusively to the United States. But by the time it gets here, the 1970s, heroin from Europe is extremely adulterated, extremely expensive, and extremely weak. And yet, it's still causing a lot of problems. There's still rising rates of use. There's still rising rates of drug-associated crime. It's a problem. But then when those congressmen went to Vietnam and they saw like the 300,000 stationed people there, 1,000 of whom are completing their year's worth of rotation, coming home every day, these men and some women are being offered massive amounts of drugs. You can get anything in Vietnam. You can get marijuana, you can get alcohol, you can get pills, and you can especially get heroin, which grows very rapidly. These poppies are very plentiful in Southeast Asia. And the heroin in Vietnam is like 97% pure and costs nothing and is being sold by children in roadside stalls along, rural highways. It was everywhere. So you knew that a lot of these men had been traumatized by war. They had been battle hardened and casualty aware. And now they were being sent back to the United States with very pronounced heroin use problems, where the drug was expensive, weak, and not readily available. And there was a lot of fear on the part of the Nixon administration about what would happen. And not only the Nixon administration, but like there was a massive firestorm of media coverage. People were kind of losing their minds with fear about what would happen when tens of thousands of quote unquote GI junkies were sent back to the United States from Vietnam.
Something that, interestingly, did not pan out in the way that people thought it would. I mean, certainly it did happen, and people came back, and it's one of the interesting things about war because you see it in the Afghan, war, and you see it in the other wars. While you do get people coming back addicted or people sort of setting up businesses, um, bringing drugs back from other places where they can get it cheaper, the rates certainly weren't as high as I think people anticipated. Do you think that was Nixon's efforts working, or just that availability, less stress, the context change reduced that? Because we see the heroin problem emerge in completely different groups, inner city core, things along those lines.
Totally. And remember that at this time in like 1971, the understanding of opioid addiction is that it is a lifelong condition. Once someone develops this dependency, they are going to have this dependency for the rest of their lives. They will be slaves to their addictions. This is sort of the generally understood scientific and medical approach to these drugs. But what happens in 1971, you're entirely right. The hordes of feared GI junkies never materialize. And that happens for a couple of reasons. The first is that with the implementation of SAODAP, the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, the federal government, the Nixon administration specifically, has a tool to wield for changing drug policy, both in the US and actually abroad. So the person who ran SAODAP, his name was Dr. Jerry Jaffe. His name is Dr. Jerry Jaffe. He's still alive. He's 92 and he's my neighbor. He lives outside of Baltimore and I know him very well and he's my buddy now. But he essentially convinced the Department of Defense to decriminalize opiate use. For the
Mm.
express purpose of this, what Dr. Jaffe suggested in order to decrease heroin use rates abroad in Vietnam was that every service person leaving the country would have to be urine screened for opiate use. This is a brand new technology. The machines were like old computers, like, right? They're huge and bulky and expensive. But Jaffe was able to get two of these machines over to Vietnam, and word got out that every person leaving the country in one of the two places where service members were being discharged would have to pee into a bottle in a trough, and that bottle would be run through the machine, which could instantly tell if the person had consumed opiates in the previous 3 days. Now, prior to this point, the military responded very forcefully to members using drugs. There was a lot of dishonorable discharges. People could be punished, they could be arrested, they could be incarcerated. After 1971, after these urine testing machines arrived, people aren't punished if they test positive for opiate use, but they have a worse punishment, which is that they're not allowed to leave Vietnam. If you test negative, you're
Ah,
allowed to get on the plane and leave. But if you test positive, you have to stay in country and sweat the drug out for a week in a barbed wire enclosed area in 100-degree heat. It was so miserable. And the idea of spending an extra week in a war zone was so
a war
unappealing.
zone in withdrawal?
In
Yeah.
withdrawal, doesn't
No, thank
sound
you.
great, you
No,
know?
no.
So once word gets out that every single person is going to be tested before they leave, you can guarantee that a whole lot of people immediately stopped using heroin. And for the people who tested positive, the military was now aware of the people who maybe didn't develop a dependency and couldn't shake their addictions. And rather than them being punished, they were detoxed in Vietnam and then sent back to the US, where they were treated for a certain period of time in a VA hospital on the West Coast. So again, there was a transformation away from punishment and towards treatment and even a certain level of aftercare. And then if those veterans continued to need care, SEODAP was then in the process of setting up hundreds of federally funded addiction treatment clinics nationwide that offered not only methadone, which was very controversial at the time, but also one of the most scientifically advanced approaches to addiction treatment, along with a lot of non-drug use, abstinence-based treatment programs like therapeutic communities, counseling, detox
Mm.
programs, all sorts of other stuff too. SEODAP was really, they called it multimodal addiction treatment clinics that offered pretty much the wide swath, well, it wasn't very wide, but the swath of treatment options available in the early 1970s, which was methadone maintenance if you wanted to use medications, or like therapeutic communities and counseling if you didn't.
So something very interesting to me about that period. You mentioned Dr. Jaffe was in Baltimore, which I call Baltimore the heroin capital.
Yeah,
Um,
you're
but
not wrong.
right, but but not because of these modern times, but because of how long the history there. Heroin in Baltimore. I covered Baltimore for a while, and that history was always fascinating to me, and I was surprised to find out that it's relationship with heroin goes long before I think any of us were really talking about it, back to the 1940s and 1950s as a port city. But it really sort of, I think, grew because you already had a longstanding drug market, but it was rooted in segregation and divestment, right? You had a lot of redlining, concentrated poverty, racial segregation, abandoned housing. It created environments in Baltimore by the time you get to the 1960s where a drug market and a drug enterprise can really flourish. And it's on I 95, right? And if you know anything about I 95 and communities that are around it, like look out because that is a major convenient, they're just like Amazon. We're the best logistics, right? Like, so it is a major drug trafficking hub. And then, you know, I think about a place like Baltimore where there was a opioid epidemic ever before our quote unquote American opioid epidemic. And you look at what happened in the latest opioid epidemic that we're still in, and, rural communities where there's been disinvestment, where industries have closed, where people have lost opportunities that are strategically located when, they're not right off the highways, but they're pretty strategically located from a transportation perspective or a medical perspective. And I feel like when I think of Baltimore and I think of the current opioid crisis, I think, oh, how we repeat our mistakes.
Mm.
But I also wonder whether we look at places like Baltimore and we say, like, we look at it through maybe a racial lens, and somewhere in the back of our minds, we're writing it off and telling ourselves that this isn't going to happen again. This is unique to these communities. Um, but then it repeats itself, this time in rural communities. And I almost feel like we're doing the same thing again, but instead of saying, oh, they're Black, it's somehow different, we're saying that they're poor and that they're in rural places. But the reality is, right now, it's truly a problem everywhere. But we do not learn lessons when it comes to drugs very well.
No, I mean, it keeps me in work as a drug historian, right? This is the second book I've written where I'm like, wow, we've done this before. We have a bad habit of putting kind of bad responses into place and then just letting them sit there. And that's just simply how it is that we respond to things. But you're absolutely right to point out Baltimore and a lot of other, East Coast cities, including Washington and New York and Philadelphia, as really glaring examples of how these cycles continue to perpetuate themselves. So I think we saw, you're right, in the heroin crisis in a lot of America's East Coast cities started much, much earlier than we think about it, right? The drug, almost all drug use in the United States actually really plummeted during World War II. International drug trafficking lanes were kind of messed up by wars in the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Mm.
They got a little disrupted. But as soon as the war ended by about 1945-46, one of the first industries to pull itself back together was international drug trafficking. And heroin started to flow back to the United States. We know that this is the Al Capone era, right? Or even a little bit later than that, where there were major mafia organizations working oftentimes with the police to bring drugs like heroin into cities like New York and Baltimore and Philadelphia and Washington. Um, it was almost exclusively segregated to Black underserviced areas in places like Harlem or areas of Baltimore, because drug traffickers knew that heroin was a very good drug to help people cope with squalid circumstances, which is indeed what places like Harlem were in the starting in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when urban segregation, prompted by the Great Migration of the 1930s, started to make itself known as not much better than Southern segregation.
Mm.
So, as these northern cities are struggling with the effects of really rising Black populations being quarantined to certain neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods are now being flooded with heroin, that is sort of the emerging nature of the early mid-century
That's so
heroin crisis.
It's so
Yeah.
interesting because you made me think of something that I haven't really thought of before. That heroin, which is a drug that, or any opioids really, but in particular heroin, it is a drug of checking out.
Yes.
It, like, if you want all your worries to go away, if you want all your thinking to go away, it is a drug that people use like that, where you might look at something like crystal meth, or you might look at something like ecstasy or cocaine as party drugs.
Hmm.
And in a way, opioids are a drug of choice for those who are already despondent.
Right.
And that's what a lot of these areas you're talking about share in common.
Right. Exactly. So, with the same despondency that you see kind of hovering over areas like, Harlem in the 1960s, especially after like the riots kind of burned down large chunks of this neighborhood, you see repeated in those desolate areas of Appalachia after the coal mines close or the logging company moves out. As soon as you see human despondency and despair It doesn't take long for a drug company to come in and take advantage of that and profiteer off of these individuals' pain. And I saw that over and over and over writing this book. And I have to say, it's the thing that actually makes me the angriest
Mm,
researching this book is how deeply exploited a lot of these individuals are. You see people suffering, you see them in oftentimes very horrific circumstances. And rather than responding to these individuals with things that would actually sort of improve their circumstances, they're sold an escalating number of drugs to help them cope with the circumstances
right.
instead, oftentimes by, as you said, checking out. It seems unfair and rather cruel, but I don't know. That's just me, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I you can look at our drug problems through like substance abuse through lots of different lenses. You can look at it through a mental health lens. You can look at it through a poverty lens. You can also look at it in a different way through a supply and demand lens. And by that, and I think that example you brought up about World War II disrupting the drug lanes is an instructive one because you mentioned that it came back very quickly once the war was over. Where there's a demand, there will always be a creative business person who will be able to come along and come up with a creative way to take advantage of that. And in that way, I think one thing that I've learned over the last 20 plus years of watching this is that I don't see the drug dealers all that different than the unscrupulous. And I don't mean to put every person in a pharmaceutical company or every company in this brush or every doctor, because it's certainly not every doctor. I think most are well meaning, but the unscrupulous doctors and the unscrupulous pharmaceutical companies and the drug dealers, not all that different. And I actually probably have more understanding of the motives of a drug dealer who may not have a degree, may not have other opportunities. But I think I get a little angry at the idea of a bunch of college educated people who have privilege, who are willing to not just take advantage, not just this being a side effect of them making money and being profitable and, living a better life, but it being the driver of it. And I think that infuriates me a bit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I talked to my friend Ben Fong a while ago. He wrote a great book about drug history called Quick Fixes, and he said that it's the legal drug purveyors who are actually way more dangerous than the illegal drug purveyors because they are ultimately shielded by a lot of business laws that allowed organizations like Purdue and Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals to sell the drugs that they sold, right? You can't stop OxyContin at the border. The customs and border agents can't go against this because it's being produced in the United States by a legal American company.
Yeah, and
Sold-
the drug dealers in Baltimore don't have lobbyists working for them. They don't have a general counsel's office. They
Exactly.
don't have. It would be interesting if they did, but
I know. I can just imagine the
whole new
lobbyists would
drug
look like,
lobby,
right? I
right?
know. There's an opportunity here.
Right.
Anyone can credit us if they're going to open a new
On
office on
K
K
Street,
Street.
right? Oh,
But it's true, and that is really the thing that kind of made me so upset when I was researching this because of how blatantly Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals really transformed from an organization full of good people trying to do something benevolent for an increasing number of people struggling with opioid addiction in the US to just being mad exploitative and being like, no, we're just going to sell this drug. And the language that they would use against patients was very stigmatizing and demeaning. There really wasn't any emphasis on the public health promotion of Suboxone at all by the end. It was just a pure sales grab, literally with like one CL reported that there was an ATM in the Suboxone provider's office, which of course they became pill mill style outlets, just like the OxyContin providers a decade before. But there's like an ATM in the office, and the people in the back are just like shoving stacks of $100 bills into
Wasn't
bags.
it?
I
Right.
mean, it's just, they knew something was going on, but it was kind of, hey, everything felt so good. They were earning so much money. Their bonuses were so big. The company was doing very well. So sometimes people have a tendency to not question the behaviors of the organization they're working for when they're benefiting too. And ultimately, this would result in the downfall of Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals. It now goes by the name Indivior, or at least the downfall of its Suboxone marketing team, which was disbanded by law after the 2020 settlement. But Indivior to this day, it's still doing fine. It has increased the number of products that it sells. It's doing very well with Sublocade, which is like a month-long shot of buprenorphine. It still sells Suboxone, even though it doesn't have its marketing team. It still sells Subutex. So, you know, for all of the damage, one might say, Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals caused by exploiting and profiteering rather than really trying to help with the opioid epidemic, they're still doing fine. They came out of this on top. And the opioid addiction problem in the US, although it has gotten better the past year with opioid overdose deaths decreasing, there's still over 80,000 a year. So I don't know if we can really mark that call that a major success. It remains a pretty big problem.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the history of how we got here, but before I did that, I want to ask a question about something. Around the same time, Suboxone was, I think, proliferating on the market as a very popular option. There were other options. I think of drugs like Vivitrol, which was the extended release drug, and you could use it in alcohol use disorder. You could use it in opioid, and I believe it was a monthly injection
Mhm.
that you could take. Um, I think a lot of us felt a lot better about a model that could block the effects of opioid that was done by injection. A lot of us were, I think, concerned would they come back for their next injection 28, 30 days later. But those drugs, and I think, they were powerful, they were, lobbied aggressively, but there were options other than things like methadone and Suboxone. And why do you think things like Suboxone became, I guess, so prominent?
That's a really important point, right? So by, let's say, 2010, actually specifically 2010, because that's the year Vivitrol comes on the market, there's kind of two options for patients if they're looking for what we can call opioid maintenance therapy, right? They can either have methadone every day or you can have buprenorphine every day. And those are drugs, they're opioids themselves. They replace the opioids in your brain so you don't go through withdrawal, but you do it once a day rather than like with heroin, you have to shoot up a bunch of times. They're FDA approved. They're produced by respectable pharmacies. You know what you're getting when you take Suboxone. You know what you're getting when you take methadone. You're taking a long-lasting opioid that will prevent withdrawal. Take it once a day, and you're good to go. Very different, of course, from the illicit marketplace. But if you're not interested in continuing opioid use and you want to pursue an alternative, you have this option called naltrexone. And naltrexone, as we kind of mentioned before, it's an opioid antagonist. And it has the fascinating ability to essentially serve as a prophylactic against opioid or alcohol use. Because when you take naltrexone, which was discovered in the 1960s.
It's kind of like Antabuse in a shot.
Exactly. So you can either take it as a daily pill. That was how it was first available from 1984 on. It was this daily pill called Trexin. So I almost forgot its name. Dear Trexin. Now I remember you. So you could take it as a daily pill, or starting in 2010, it was called Vivitrol, and it's about a month-long shot. And Vivitrol was really important because the thing about naltrexone is that it's non-reinforcing. It's a drug you take that doesn't have any effects itself. If you take naltrexone, like if you were to take it right now, we would essentially not feel any effects. but you take it so you don't take other drugs. Now, naltrexone can only be taken by someone who has gone through a full and total detox. If they
Mm-hmm.
have any opioids left in their brain, the naltrexone will immediately kick the opioids out and send that person into withdrawal, which is a really painful and debilitating experience. But if you've gone through detox,
They
you're
have
totally
to
clear.
wean off
They
first.
totally have to wean off first, and that can be hard, right?
Yes.
That can be a really difficult hurdle to get over. But if you get off and
Yeah,
you're
because
totally
opioid withdrawal is not going to kill you like alcohol withdrawal, but it will feel like it.
y-
It'll
they,
feel worse.
it will
Right.
be unpleasant,
Yes.
deeply unpleasant, and the effects can last. I mean, beyond the initial nausea and discomfort and pain and vomiting and diarrhea, like it really is. It's like the worst flu, times 20. But then the lingering effects can last. Oftentimes, people use opioids to cover for co-occurring morbidities,
Hmm.
mostly psychiatric, right? So people are dealing maybe with a lot of depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And the opioids they've been using have been tamping those down. But once you're off of those opioids, those co-occurring mental disorders can also, raise their heads, and that can be an issue as
It's
well. So,
interesting you say that. I remember a psychiatrist that I worked with say to me, we were having a conversation about what do you do with a patient where you have tried all the medications in the universe? That's a normal conversation we have. But but this patient is deathly suicidal. You were worried that they are going to commit suicide.
mm,
What he said is, what I will do, not that this was legal, is prescribe opiates.
mm,
And that will prevent a suicide in a patient like that. And I get why he would do that unconventional thing, primarily because the man just didn't care what the FDA or DEA thought. But like, it really does go to the fact that a lot of people that I've seen over the years who have ended up with opioid addiction, they did actually have back pain, or they did have a mental health issue, or they
mm,
were in an accident, or they had some other chronic condition, that autoimmune disease or something else like that, that was real and alive. And with most drug addiction, you've got to face yourself to come out of it, which is hard enough. But then to also say, I'm going to face the pain
mm,
that I turned off, whether that is mental or physical pain, it's quite an ask. It's really interesting. So I think of a lot of the clients I've had over the years, I think of my first one. He was in a car accident, opioid addicted, and truly just became addicted to the opioids, and was trying to wane off of them slowly and up and down. And he was functional, he was able to work, but it did interfere with his life. And then I remember others who struggled and connived, abused things. One of my favorite stories, this client comes in to my office and he has just scammed a doctor out of he's like tricked him into writing a bunch of opioid prescriptions. And he hands it to me and he's like, I'm giving this to you because I don't want to use it.
mm.
So I rip it up, swallow half of it, drop part of it in the trash can in front of me, and then take the other parts to trash cans in the building and drop them off. I'm like, he's dying laughing. And I'm like, I know you're an addict, man. If I throw this in the trash can, you'll be breaking in my office at 12 p.m.
Oh, God. I can't believe you
Get it.
ate part of it. That's
Yes. Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
commitment. That's commitment right
Commitment
there.
and also partially show, right? Partially show. But it's true. Like, if you know addicts, like, I can in this moment really not want to do it. But I can't guarantee 25 minutes from now I won't be crawling through the ceiling tiles
Right. Right.
to get that back again. But I also remember this other client, with Suboxone later in the years of seeing it. I definitely saw a lot of people abusing it they would hoard Suboxone. So when they couldn't get heroin or they couldn't get OxyContin, they had something that would prevent them from going in withdrawal. which it makes me laugh because that is one of the selling points, like you mentioned before, that you don't have to be completely off of it for it to be effective and help you get off of it. But that also makes it a great bridge
Right.
between when you're able to use, when your supply is cut off, and when you can restart your supply. So I had this one client, great guy. I had known his father in another context, and he brought him into me. And he had tried everything, titrating down, Suboxone, pick. It all ended up back on the opioids. And the craziest thing, we titrated him off over 2 weeks and finally got him off heroin and back to his normal life on an opioid tea.
Oh,
No, not
wow.
even kidding. Reducing on an opioid tea. And that was, to me, that was like real commitment on his part. And I don't know whether it would work for everyone else. But it's just very fascinating to me. Uh, I wonder when I think of these things, could the companies have anticipated that? Did they actually anticipate that kind of misuse? Do they, or are they as blind to it as we are?
That's a good question. That's a good question. So to just jump back a little bit, though, just to finish what we were saying about naltrexone, I think you bring up something really important, which is like it takes a lot of preparation to get off of opioids completely, and naltrexone requires you to get off of opioids completely. And so when you don't have those as a crutch, that can be kind of scary. But some people actually really appreciate the regimen of naltrexone. They really appreciate the insurance of knowing that they can't use opioids no matter how much they injected or however many pills they took. They
Just
wouldn't be
doesn't
able to
work.
feel the effects. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So there's this sort of idea called conditioning, right? And extinction of the desire and the craving to use these drugs because you simply know it's not going to work anymore. And that is a really powerful way to go about achieving recovery. And it works. For a certain number of people, naltrexone and specifically Vivitrol, so you don't have to take the pill every day, right, has been a lifesaver and it's been a very good thing. But it's also a weird way to go about enforcing sobriety if the person doesn't want the shot. And if they get it, they've had 28 days away from opioid use. It can make them more susceptible to overdose because once the naltrexone
Yep.
is out of their system, they might use again, their tolerance is down, right? So there are
And
benefits.
that trick to tolerance is a really tough one because we know coming out of addiction treatment facilities that people are super vulnerable
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
because, they'll go back to their habit and their tolerance is down, but they'll go back to exactly what they did before and end up ODing. So we know that window coming out of treatment is really, really risky.
Right, right. It's one of the most dangerous times. And the potential for overdose, especially deadly overdose, is very high. But that's the thing, right? So we're left in this moment, in the year of our Lord 2026, we have basically three medications if you have for to treat opioid addiction, right? We have methadone, which was first discovered in the 1930s and came to national use in the 1970s, 50 years ago. We have buprenorphine, which was discovered in the 1960s and came to national prominence in the early 2000s. And we have naltrexone, which was also discovered in the early 1960s and has been pretty much widely available since 2010. So those are three old drugs in three imperfect systems with benefits and downfalls that are widely known. None of them are perfect, obviously, or we wouldn't have the overdose death rates that we have, but it's all we've got. And we've been stuck with these drugs for decades in systems that are insufficient, oftentimes profiteering, oftentimes punitive, and oftentimes inaccessible. And yet, very little has been done to change this situation. We've watched the problems get compounded, and yet, very little has been done to make a real market change. And that's the thing that I would say also upset me the most in writing this book. And I was able to go to another country. I went to Switzerland to compare treatment clinics over there. But I am fascinated the same way you are that we have very pronounced problems with opioid use in this country, very pronounced problems with overdose deaths. And yet, our response to it, whether it includes medications or not, has been really insufficient to the problem at hand. And yet, very little has changed for, I don't know, say going on 30 years.
So, one thing I wanted to ask you about, just sort of jumping backwards a little bit, I have these vivid memories from the 1980s and the 1990s and the war on drugs in general, things like the Just Say No campaign. And I remember even seeing, just like you described, the methadone clinics in sort of like really seedy areas of town. And, I always felt like coming out of the Reagan years, there was a recognition that this whole just say no, some say no idea was not going to work. And, in my own addiction, which came later, um, I really ended up taking the abstinence path, right? Like no medication assistance. And there is a big sort of like debate within the world of recovery, which is like, should you take the abstinence path or should you take the path of, having some kind of assistance, medical assistance? And I think when I first got clean and sober, my initial thought was like, this abstinence path really works. And I've seen it work for a lot of people. When I became a treatment provider, my lens kind of broadened a little bit because when you're sitting there with a client who might die, who you're responsible for, you really start to think about harm reduction,
Mhm.
right? And it's very difficult to tell who's ready for the abstinence route and who needs the harm reduction route. And one of the things that I really think I loved about this new approach of using more um, medically assisted treatment was that we could reduce harm. But the other part of me also felt like we also may be continuing addiction too,
Mm.
protecting people from or protecting people from consequences, but also that may cause them to become clean and sober. But also on the other hand, we're putting them into this other addiction machine. We may be sort of like in some percentage of those clients just prolonging it until they decide to go back to heroin or decide to go back to whatever it was. So many years later, I am in a totally different job, but all my jobs seem to come back to drugs. Um, and I'm working for a large healthcare um, organization, and I'm working with their C-suite executives. They're not a pharmaceutical company, but they do direct delivery and care. And their head of medical affairs, who was in their C-suite, really cerebral guy, very like smart about quality. And we used to just talk about like the books we're reading, whether we were talking about leadership or other things like that. And one day and I think Sam Kunis really captures this in Dreamland. And we were talking about that history, the just so no, the other elements. But in the book Dreamland, he really captures, and this doctor was talking to me about this, how a couple things came together. One, the medical community recognized that it was not treating patients' pain. It wasn't prioritizing it. And the medical community, the AMA, made pain the fifth vital sign. At the same time, you have this oversupply of prescription opioids already happening. And then Keonis talks about how folks in Baja California and Mexico, these traffickers, were able to create these small, tightly organized networks that realize that when the doctors stop prescribing, heroin can fill the gap. And all these things kind of came together. Innovation by drug organizations faster than law enforcement or healthcare companies, innovation by pharmaceutical companies before regulators. All of that stuff came together, and you can almost map where the traffickers ultimately set up with where the pain clinics were. And you could throw on top of that map where the drug marketing representatives were going. Like it was all congregating in these same places. And I just think to myself, like, does medically assisted treatment really have a place in this wild, crafty, complicated um, system where a lot of people are incentivized to keep people addicted?
Mm,
And some of those are the same ones who have to be the the sharp end of the spear when it comes to medically assisted treatment.
right. And I think a lot of the critics of MAT would say, no, it does not serve a place. It's perpetuating these dependencies. It's causing more problems than it solves. It leads to a lot of profiteering. We saw this not only with the Suboxone, the sort of pain pill style clinics, but early in the 1970s when the Nixon administration started opening methadone clinics. There are a lot of private practitioners who got into the business of selling methadone as well. Selling drugs oftentimes brings in unscrupulous people, whether they're working at the illicit or licit marketplace. Oftentimes, it brings in some shady characters. Because ideally, with a drug, you have a lot of repeat customers. That's how the money is made. But I think its supporters would say that there has to be a place for medication assisted treatment because of the unique nature of opioid dependency, opioid addiction, and opioid use, and the fact that users are an extremely heterogeneous population. It's really hard to nail down the typical opioid user in the United States today. There's such a diverse group. I'm actually working right now on a contract writing gig where I am profiling victims of the fentanyl epidemic, people who have died because of adulterated drugs, because of overdoses on fentanyl. And it is everybody from a
Mm.
15-month-old girl in California to teenagers to 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds. It's absolutely everybody. Age, sex, race, it doesn't matter. Socioeconomic background, it doesn't matter. The users are so heterogeneous because the United States has been inundated with opioids for, well, if we said things really restarted in the 1940s, we're going on 80 years, and very little has really been done to stem this tide in any actionable sense. So, examples from abroad, I went to Switzerland and looked at clinics there, suggest that the best way to approach opioid addiction and the resulting problems that it causes, like, if you're sharing needles, it can result in the spread of HIV, hepatitis C, various other problems. The easiest and most effective way to address these problems is to offer a wide variety of treatment to the widest number of people and make it attractive and make it available. And even if someone starts off on methadone or buprenorphine or something like that, they may not have to stay on it forever. Some people might. But the ideal is a non judgmental clinic that offers a
Mm.
variety of options, of treatment options for people to explore at their own in their own way in a patient centric approach that allows the patient to really take control of their recovery journey. And that's what other,
And that's who needs to be managing it,
and
truly.
that's who needs to be
Right.
managing it.
And so the idea there would be that we have options for people, many different options for them to be able to try to find the one that works for them,
For
to
them.
to do
Yeah.
it without judgment, to allow them to uh, navigate that process. Like I think of the client that I mentioned before who did the opioid tea thing. He was really, really committed at that point,
Mm.
right? But he would tell you that a year before, when he first started trying to get off, he wasn't really committed. So those things worked in a different way, and he was willing to try different things as he went through the process. So maybe having those options in the role of the medical community and the treatment community is to help guide you through it. But I feel like, you know, we have to do something about the unscrupulous people, and we have to disincentivize the people who make money off of, because they need to be able to make money because that's what companies do, but disincentivize they're making money off of harm. And I don't know how to do that.
Well, it would be great if we could actually go back to 50 years ago and give the Nixon administration's approach a try one more time. This was this moment when there was a real sense of imagination and a new approach to addiction treatment. Prior to 1971, for the most part, the only response to addiction was law enforcement. If you were caught with heroin, you were caught with drugs, you were going to be criminally prosecuted and probably thrown in jail. What the Nixon administration said in 1971 was, we're going to try something different. We're going to offer treatment in a wide variety of options, in a wide variety of locations. We'll make it attractive. We'll make it available because for the most part, we're going to make it free. Now, this whole process fell apart when the administration, specifically Nixon himself, started approaching it more from a political perspective. The goal for him was, yes, to prevent GI junkies from running amok in America and to bring down rates of heroin use, but mostly it was to bring down rates of crime so he would get elected in 1972. And the thing is, it kind of worked, right? Widespread access to addiction treatment, plus the French Connection got busted, resulted in crime rates dropping fairly dramatically, especially in urban areas between 1971 and 72. So this big push to make addiction treatment available really did work. Crime went down, overdose rates went down, drug arrests went down, and for the most part, this emphasis on demand reduction rather than supply reduction really benefited a lot of people. But it sort of fell apart when that political project became way more important than the public health aspect of it. So when clinics started opening rapidly,
So that created a gap for
created
the
a gap, right?
unscrupulous people.
Right. So all of a sudden you have, geez, the federal government's pumping a lot of money into this. There's not a lot of regulation or oversight because SEODAP's a pretty small organization and can't oversee every single clinic across the United States at all times. And the private practitioners are getting in on it too. As soon as it turns into an overly political project and an overly profitable project, the public health experiment that the Nixon administration launched kind of fell apart. But it fell apart and continued to stay fallen
Keep on
apart.
going as a zombie.
Is a zombie for 50 years. And I think we don't have the ability to even envision something like what Nixon did 50 years ago. Because as you said, it's totally divested right now, right? Like when it comes to addiction treatment, you have two approaches. You can go to your methadone clinic or go get your Suboxone from your provider, or you can go to a 12-step program or an abstinence-based program, but never the twain shall meet. There are very few
Mm,
systems or programs in the US that actually combine these two. But if we were to actually reimagine a really proper public health infrastructure for addiction treatment nationwide that included all of the available options and made them all available without stigma, without sort of saying this one's better than this one and this is what you should do. Instead, letting people choose from a suite of options for whatever would take them to achieve recovery on their own. That would be, I think, the greatest of all possible worlds and probably would have the most extensive benefits. But it's hard because we haven't tried it for 50 years. And the last time we did, it didn't go that well. So the
right.
precedent isn't so great. It would require a real radical imagining of a whole new world of treatment that I don't know. Hopefully, if people read my book, they're like, "Yeah, we
Courage.
can do it again." But so far, we haven't been able to pull it off. It's a bummer.
Courage. And also to your point, you know, I think it's really easy for people. So in psychotherapy, they talk about this like, oh, I'm a CBT therapist or I am a dialectic behavioral therapist. But there's this famous psychologist, Yalom, who's like, this is insane. You learn every skill you can and you bring whatever form of a skill to the table that your client needs at the moment. And I don't think that's everyone. And I think it's really easy for people to get in their silos and think of things very narrowly. So I think it would require a change in the way that we do medical education, more addiction education, it would change. I feel like the federal government would have to drive policy changes and change incentives for people. But this does bring me to sort of kind of one of my closing questions. One of the things that really sort of I think stands out to me is that in all these things, whether we're talking about absence or we're talking about medication, a lot of this comes back to, like, I think of what we were talking about with Baltimore or these rural areas in Appalachia where people have lost opportunities, jobs, housing, whatever it may be, that there's something even deeper than that that's missing. Social bonds, mutual support, local institutions, a sense of belonging and community are missing. And in a world where that's missing, and you have a drug like opioids um, that can sort of check you out of the world, and you have, at least in my opinion, an American society that has such discomfort with pain, whether that's mental or physical,
Mm.
that we just want to run away from it. I just wonder for you, if we were to put you in charge of the world and
All right, I accept.
right. Okay, you got it. What what would you recommend as the solution?
Well, I think you're so correct in pointing out that even if we had the most amazing forms of addiction treatment and care, it may not replace the lost social bonds. It may not help with the vast swaths of divestment and depression that have ruptured countless places across this country. But I don't think it would be a bad place to start. Right. There are community clinics, there are federally qualified health centers, there are the traveling clinics, like the traveling free clinics, dental clinics, and primary care that go around and take care of the communities that are so desperate for access to physical health care, mental health care, and behavioral health care. We know that there's a demand for it. We know that there's a need for it. And there is something really extraordinary about having, say, a clinic you can go to. You're not going to be judged. You're not going to be stigmatized. There's people who understand your condition. They're willing to help you. And not only do you get things like access to behavioral health care, maybe addiction treatment, counseling, whatever, but it would be really incredible if we could model places again like Switzerland that also offer general medical care at these places. I mean, oftentimes this is an individual's only interaction with the healthcare system. It would be great if you could bring that person in for addiction treatment because they can't do any more fentanyl. They're tired of the lifestyle. They want to get off of it. And by the way, you also have really high blood pressure. And by the way, you're also dealing with anxiety and depression. You get your psychiatric meds here. Oh, and by the way, you have dental problems. Like we have, a dentist on site. We have like associations to basic healthcare for all forms of healthcare that are required for this individual. And you have access to social services, and you can talk to counselors, and you can get signed up for Medicaid, and you can get help with housing, and you can get help with a sober home, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I know that this is a dream, right? This is the ideal, but it's not impossible. And there are certain places in the US, I've seen places like this in Baltimore, in St. Louis, in other cities where these systems of care are trying to be created and made available for the people who need them. Because you know what? You might not solve all the problems that this individual is undergoing. Those are probably structural issues that would require more than just a clinic. But I think if you start to bridge the gaps and invite that person back into society through access to addiction treatment, through access to healthcare, maybe through access to like some food and new
Mhm.
clothes, that's the way you bring people back. That's how you actually build the bridges to recovery. And that would be something that I know from talking to a lot of people for this book that survivors really would have wanted for the family members that they've lost to opioid use and overdose and addiction and death. So I think giving people the option, it's not going to solve the whole problem, and it never will, but it's not a bad place to start.
Yeah. It I think someone could make the argument that treating addiction is like mopping a floor while the pipe is still leaking, right? Like you can clean up the mess all day, but nothing changes until you fix the source. And if our source is really sort of like, it has to do with all these basic needs that are at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, safety, belonging, all those other things. Um, we probably need to address both, but I like to think about it in a little different way. I think that, and I see this with people who have mental health conditions, and there's medication. And I remember this guy from my parents' church, his son was struggling with mental health stuff, and I was on meds and had gone through the long list of different meds. And he said to me, we're having a meal, and he said to me, because I had gotten much more stable, the meds don't fix everything, do they? And I was like, of course they don't. They really don't. But you know what they do? They give you a fighting chance. And I almost see, like, if you give people who are suffering addiction the fighting chance at life by treating their addiction, then they have the opportunity to be a part of building belonging, a part of building community. They have an opportunity to integrate back in society and address some of those bigger challenges. So I think maybe looking at it through that lens is a more optimistic one. Like every addict that we pull off the field of addiction is another person who can contribute to building a better community.
Amen to that. I 100% agree. Exactly. Well, okay, so since you put me in charge of the world, we can just build this system now. This is going to be great.
You want to do it together?
Yeah,
Right.
we're a team.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for coming on and talking to me. I appreciate this. It's obviously a topic that we're both passionate about, but I wanted to give you a chance before you go to just give any closing thoughts. I'm curious about, just given this research, the knowledge you put in your head. You mentioned the survivors and the addicts themselves, and even the people who are part of the public health and business side of it. I'm curious, and take it wherever you want to go, but I'm curious about what your sort of hopes and dreams are when it comes to all of this.
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess I would say that I was originally inspired to write this book because of the death of a friend of mine from our little high school in Allentown, Pennsylvania. His name was Dana. He was a couple years younger than me, but we did the school plays every year. And he was just kinetic, this totally vibrant, amazing force, very small, like less than 5 feet tall, under 100 pounds, um, but just an absolutely brilliant, funny guy. And when I found out that after about 15 years of escalating opioid use, he had hanged himself in the woods behind our old middle school, I was really just sort of broken up inside because Dana was such a lively presence to me. And I couldn't believe that we had lost him before he was even into his adulthood. He was 30 years old. Um, but my high school had lost a lot of people like that. We had lost a lot of people to overdoses, to drug use, and to suicides. And I don't think that we are unusual in that sense. I don't think that Allentown, Pennsylvania is actually that different from most of the places across the country dealing with massive levels of opioid use, drug use, suicides, and overdoses throughout the late 2010s and into the early 2020s. But I really wanted to know how we had failed Dana, why our treatment systems were so insufficient, and what had allowed him to fall through the cracks. And I don't think I'm alone in that question. I think we all have a Dana. I think, and if you don't have a specific Dana that you can think of off the top of your head, you have a friend who has a Dana, you have a family member who has a Dana, your partner has a Dana. By this point, we've all been affected by this ongoing drug crisis. And I think that if we really look at the mistakes we made in the past and the successes we've had in the past, and we really understand how we got to this point, we can start to ask for better treatment. One of the quotes I have in the beginning of the book, which I'm now going to paraphrase and probably screw up because don't have it right in front of me. But it's this quote from 1994 by Vincent Dole, who was one of the doctors who originated methadone maintenance in the mid 1960s. And he said, "We've reached a point in the American drug problem where we're getting what we ask for." And I think for a very long time, for decades and decades, we've really denigrated drug users. They are the lepers of our society. They are stigmatized. We don't care if they die. We don't care if they get bad treatment. It doesn't matter. But we can't feel that way anymore when we all have a Dana and we all care about someone who has struggled with these issues. And if we start to really ask for better treatment for our loved ones and for ourselves, well, go figure, we might just be able to get it. And I hope my book shows us how we got to this point, what we can do about it in the future, and what a potential future might look like. And if I get any of that, I will die. I will die a happy woman with a smile on my face. I'll
Yeah.
have succeeded.
Yeah. One step forward at a time, right? That it
Yeah,
matters.
one small step forward followed by 25 steps back. That's American drug policy.
Let's not do that.
Oh, right.
Let's
Well,
make it.
we're in charge of the world, so we can do it.
Yeah.
We won't
Let's
do that.
let's at least get the ratio to 5 to 25.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good.
You know how many lives that is, right? If we can get it to 5 to 25,
Oh,
we've
don't ask me a math question. Oh, no.
that's a lot of saved lives. It's a
That's a
lot
lot.
of
Okay,
saved
that's what I'll
lives.
go for, a
That's a
lot.
lot.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I think this is a great place to stop it, and I really appreciate you coming on. And I will look forward to staying connected in the future.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely delightful conversation. I'm so happy we've connected. This is great.
Uh, If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, and to support the podcast, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/the Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.